As we covered here earlier, the Build Back Better Act finally passed the House after months of negotiations that saw spending for the legislation almost halved. Initiatives scaled back or completely thrown away included free community college and dental and vision coverage under Medicare.
But what didn't hit the cutting room floor is corporate Democrats' raising of the SALT cap, a policy that critics say essentially amounts to a tax break for the wealthy. The SALT cap hike, which is the bill's second most expensive provision, will only affect the 13% of Americans who itemize their tax returns. The revision has already become Republican campaign fodder. Check out this ad from GOP Representative Jason Smith.
But it's time for corporate America and the wealthiest 1% of Americans to just begin to pay their fair share.
Fair share? Let's talk about the wealthy's fair share in the Democrats' agenda. Let's talk about SALT. No, not that kind. I'm talking about the state and local tax cap, SALT. Basically, the Democrats' way of giving the rich a tax cut. Let's break it down. There are two families, one in Farmington, Missouri, and one in New York City. This family makes $45,000 a year. This family makes $4.5 million a year. Biden's adjustment to the SALT cap means the first family gets a tax cut of about $20. The second family, about $25,000.
Here to weigh in on the SALT cap hike and what it means for Democrats' future is Briahna Joy Gray. She's host of the Bad Faith podcast and former national press secretary for the Sanders campaign. Welcome back, Briahna.
Thank you.
So that was interesting to see. Republicans are going to go after Democrats on not taxing the wealthy enough. As I live and breathe, what a day this is.
Yeah, I love to look at a Republican attack ad and shrug my shoulders and say, "Where's the lie? I'm with that nice blonde family from the Midwest."
Your former boss Bernie Sanders is using kind of this precise line of attack from Republicans to make his case that, look, we need to fix this in the Senate. I think he's given up on appealing to Democrats to do the right thing and to follow through on their agenda as they have kind of run on it. And instead, he's saying, look, just from a raw politics and raw power perspective, this is catastrophic. Do you think that he's going to be able to? Apparently, Manchin kind of agrees with him. Do you think that he's going to be able to make traction in the Senate? Do you think Republicans are helping a little bit by previewing what these attacks are going to look like?
Look, Bernie, as often he is right about this. His proposal is to limit the cap to families making under $400,000 a year, a noble effort. Although one might also point out that that's still very affluent Americans getting a tax cut when so many hands were wrung over the idea of extended unemployment benefits and $2,000 checks, which I will remind everybody, people never really got without that weird, funny math about 600 and 1,400 and yada, yada, yada. At the end of the day, this is still a tax cut for the rich, and it's bad optics even if it's marginally saved. Do I think it's actually going to work? Maybe, but it's one of these, what does my colleague, Senator Nina Turner, like to say, half a bowl of poop kind of a moment. You know, I remember a Bernie Sanders that had as one of his policy proposals a plan to cancel all medical debt. And that proposal only cost $81 billion. This proposal cost $275 billion, over 3 times as much as, again, canceling everyone's medical debt. Now, that was the medical debt before the pandemic. I would imagine it's quite a bit higher after the crisis that we've been in for the last year or two. But there's no proposal on the table to do that. There's no proposal to have any money spent on those kinds of funds. We're sitting here talking about a tax cut for the rich. And frankly, I welcome some criticism from the right, even if it's bad faith, because these are the kind of conversations we should be having about the misspent efforts of the people that we've elected to represent us.
Especially if there's still time to have this conversation, right? Before we get into campaign season, before we get into Republicans really hammering Democrats on what they don't like about the bill. What is it's still the case, right? The kind of the movement to do the SALT cap it's moderate Democrats pushing for it, right?
Yes, it was a bipartisan caucus, wasn't it? And I would say beware anything that comes under the flag of bipartisanship, not because it's not an idealistic way to view the world or an ideal that we should all be pursuing. But in reality, what it often is a demonstration of the extent to which there are very much shared interests between corporate Democrats and corporate Republicans. And a lot of the culture war battles we're in that divide us up are created out of thin air by people like Christopher Rufo, who created the CRT business, to distract us from the fact that overwhelming majorities of Americans do not, in fact, want the rich to get another tax cut and would, in fact, prefer spending to be on kitchen table issues.
Yeah. I don't know if I agree that. I mean, there's a lot of bad faith podcasts. There's a lot of bad faith, obviously, on the debate about critical race theory, whatever you want to call it. I have disagreed with Rufo on some stuff. I think he's sincere in thinking that the kinds of things he's complaining about in schools are in fact bad, and I probably agree that at least a good number of them are bad. They do distract. Now they're harder to solve, and they're certainly harder for a national. There's little role, I think, for like the national government to play in fixing these issues. So I guess they're a distraction in that kind of sense because they consume the national political figures want to spend all their time talking about the culture war. But I mean, they do that because people are interested in it, right? It's not totally made up. There aren't good solutions, so they should spend their time differently. But there is a real kind of frustration or resentment about some of these things. I think there are Democrats, there are minority voters who feel like that too.
Look at the magic that I just did by just saying the word CRT in the middle of this conversation. Now we're having a conversation about CRT. I also happen to have mentioned the fact that it would only take $81 billion to cancel medical debt. At least that was the number before the pandemic. And this money obviously exists because it's being funneled into tax cuts for the rich. But there's not as much of a cultural appetite for picking up on those kinds of things. And there is a world where we all trot out Americans who have suffered medical debt. 50% of all bankruptcy cases are the consequence of medical debt. Trot out people who have been struggling to afford insulin and other kinds of life-preserving medication and have them talk about how that's ruined their lives. And yet we're not seeing Fox News panels or CNN panels about those folks. We're seeing people very deeply concerned about the effect of beloved on their children. And that's a toxic reality of our current political climate.
And one point on SALT, the argument for it is it's a deduction for the amount of money that you pay in state and local taxes, so that it's supposed to encourage localities to be able to have a strong tax base that they can fund schools, fire, police, the sort of local things. So the argument was, well, if you get rid of this deduction, then all of these states are going to cut spending on schools and cut spending on fire and lower taxes. Instead, what New York State actually raised taxes on the rich most recently after. Now, there may have been some coincidental influences going on there, but it certainly didn't stop them from raising taxes on the rich. So what do you make of the underlying argument for SALT, given that New York Democrats were like, no, sorry, you don't get a SALT deduction. We're still raising taxes on the richest people in New York.
I mean, there are obviously many more people involved in those kinds of local legislative decisions than are the senators that are involved in voting on the SALT cap, right? I remember that Andrew Cuomo was a big proponent of getting rid of the SALT cap, right? So it's neither here nor there, but it is a little bit confusing to me, given that this deduction seems to affect, it's obviously large amounts of money on the table, but the people who are pushing for it the most have such enormous amounts of money. Millionaires and billionaires talking about, tens of thousands of dollars of tax credits. And I maybe it's just, this is my poor person brain talking, and I just don't realize that the way you get to be a millionaire and a billionaire is collecting every $1,000 in this sort of a way, but it does seem to be a disproportionate amount of political energy and political cost spent on something by a group of people that has so much money that this shouldn't really be it. I understand, getting inside information about what's going to happen to a defense stock down the line. I understand all kinds of other insider deals that can result in all kinds of enormous windfalls. This particular one, it's a bit of a mystery. Maybe some insiders like yourself, Ryan, can shed some light on that. I'll read some reporting over at The Intercept. But this does seem the cost benefit in terms of even the benefit for the very, very wealthy,
right,
versus the political cost that will be accrued it doesn't seem like that.
That's a
this was
good
worth
point.
it.
Like that family that in New York that makes $4.5 million in an attack ad, they'll take the $25,000. But that's not changing their life. They're not moving.
That's a month's rent.
They're not moving out of the state. They're not making major life choices over $25,000. Now, somebody who needs that $25,000 certainly would, but that family doesn't. But anyway, Briahna, co-host of the Bad Faith podcast, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you both.
And we will have more Rising right after this.